In an era of profound geopolitical transformations and economic uncertainties, the analyses of three authoritative Italian voices, Dario Fabbri, Lucio Caracciolo, and Federico Rampini, offer a compass for understanding the dynamics reshaping global balances. From the internal crisis of the United States to the systemic challenge posed by China, through Europe's disorientation and the debate surrounding the very legacy of the West, a complex picture emerges. The analysis of Dario Fabbri and Lucio Caracciolo converges in painting a picture of an America going through a deep internal crisis, a malaise that extends beyond politics and touches the very identity of the nation. It is not Donald Trump who created this historical moment, rather, it is the American historical moment that produced a figure like Trump. The United States, as Fabbri explains, is an aging and relatively affluent country, yet deeply divided and weary. This fatigue stems from decades of imperial rule, increasingly felt as an unsustainable burden. The inner Americans, far from the cosmopolitan coasts of New York and California that dominate the media imagination, feel depressed and angry. Fabbri cites alarming data. In 2023, 29% of Americans were diagnosed with clinical depression, out of a population of 335 million, and the previous year saw over 150,000 deaths from fentanyl overdose, a synthetic opioid coming from China via Mexico. Caracciolo adds a significant social data point. Out of 100 marriages in the U.S., only 4 are between Democrats and Republicans, a sign of polarization tearing apart the social fabric. It's as if the nation has split in two. This frustration arises from the perception that the role of world police and buyer of last resort, importing goods to create strategic dependency in others while maintaining control over global sea routes, a system Fabbri compares to the Roman Empire after the defeat of Carthage, has impoverished the American middle class to the benefit of the elites. Caracciolo notes that the rich are better off today than 30 years ago, and of allies perceived as parasites. Fabbri cites the historical example of Tiberius Gracchus against the Italics. Americans, Fabbri emphasizes, have discovered that the world does not want to become American, generating a deep identity crisis in a people who saw themselves as the city on the hill, the beacon of humanity. Caracciolo defines this as the decline of the American empire, driven by the will of the Americans themselves to no longer be an empire. Trump's presidency, re-elected despite a failed coup attempt, embodies this discontent. America does not have an imperial culture like Britain's, it was born in opposition to empire. There is a divide between a missionary minority wanting to redeem the world and a majority that says, leave me alone. Today, the latter prevails, disillusioned by a post-Cold War empire that has seen the standard of living for the middle class deteriorate. The $100,000 a year suburban house with a garden is no longer a given. This malaise is also reflected in the cultural crisis, with phenomena like woke and the conservative reaction sweeping through universities and society, undermining the foundations of liberal democracy and accentuating the plutocratic nature of the system. Economic policy, particularly the use of tariffs, is at the heart of Trump's strategy but reflects deeper trends. Fabbri clarifies that the American Constitution entrusts commercial policy to Congress, but laws from the 1970s, 1973 and 1977, delegated to the president the power to impose tariffs in state of exception. The Trump administration uses this power, playing on semantics, equating tariffs with sanctions, provided for by law in case of unfair trade practices and national emergency. However, not all tariffs imposed by Trump are the same. Those on Europe, according to Fabbri, are tariffs of anger, expressions of frustration toward allies seen as ungrateful and parasitic, freeloaders, in Caracciolo's term. They have lukewarm support from state apparatuses, such as the Treasury Department, and may have a shorter lifespan. They are based on a partial view. They ignore the American surplus in services, streaming platforms, social networks, all American, focusing only on manufacturing, a sector where the U.S. has a structural deficit chosen since the 1980s, Reagan era, to serve as the buyer of last resort. The goal of massively bringing manufacturing back home seems unrealistic with a 4% unemployment rate, almost physiological, and a workforce not necessarily available or suitable. Tariffs on China and Mexico, on the other hand, are tactical and have greater support in the apparatus, Pentagon, CIA, etc. The goal is not so much reshoring, which Fabry calls a large-scale nonsense, but to reduce the Chinese trade surplus. Why? Because China, like the US, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, uses the economy as a tool of power. Its surplus does not only go to welfare but to military technological innovation, military spending, and internal transfers to prevent social implosions. Attacking the surplus means limiting these capabilities. Caracciolo adds that this tariff offensive, while hitting a significant bilateral trade, in 2024, $582 billion total, with a U.S. deficit of $295 billion, is paradoxically strengthening China's economic sphere of influence in Asia. China-ASEAN trade $962 billion, plus Japan $266 billion, plus South Korea $322 billion. It is important to note that this protectionist trend is not just Trumpian. The Biden administration has maintained many tariffs and introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, $300 billion for U.S. production, to the detriment of allies, and specific tariffs on Chinese products, 100% on cars, 75% on solar panels, 50% on lithium batteries. Finally, emerging figures like Elon Musk play a crucial role. Fabry recalls that Musk, though a private entrepreneur, depends on government contracts. SpaceX has received over $30 billion. Trump gave him the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, a ministry without a portfolio, with the announced goal, by Musk, of cutting the federal budget by 1/3, riding the anti-bureaucratic wave. This clash with the deep state, a Turkish term, notes Fabry, the 5-6 million federal employees who outlast presidents and limit their power, is a key dynamic. Rampini defends Musk, seeing him as an agent of efficiency challenging sclerosis-ridden bureaucracies, comparing SpaceX versus Boeing, and contests the idea of an unchanging American oligarchy, highlighting how tech giants, Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg, are self-made first-generation men, unlike more dynastic European elites, citing the list of Italian billionaires. The competition with China is unanimously identified as the central challenge of our time. Caracciolo defines it as the central challenge worldwide. It is the main engine of America's strategic reorientation. Globalization, understood as China's entry into the WTO, promoted by Bill Clinton 25 years ago, with the illusion that it would become a liberal democratic, pro-American country, is considered a failure by the U.S. establishment. That dream has shattered. China used economic openness to strengthen its authoritarian model and power, not to conform to the West. Today, China, while facing internal problems, demography, inequalities between the coast and the interior, economic slowdown, cited by Caracciolo and Rampini, holds a dominant position in key manufacturing sectors. It produces half of the world's chemicals, half of the ships. The U.S. hardly builds any more, 2/3 of electric vehicles, 3/4 of electric batteries, 9/10 of solar panels, and rare earths. It is rapidly advancing in robotics, space technology. The moon is now very Chinese. Nuclear and artificial intelligence. Caracciolo cites, of 100 AI patents in 2024, 62 from the US, 21 from China, 2 from Europe. Rampini mentions China's DeepSeek response to Trump, Musk's AI projects. America, according to Caracciolo, wants to give up global hegemony but not supremacy. It wants to be number one, not necessarily the ultimate governor. This supremacy is based on the dollar and technology, both of which are under attack today. The dollar is challenged by alternative systems, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, BRICS currencies, and the mistrust generated by the use of sanctions, freezing Russian assets, which is pushing other countries to seek alternatives. Technology is the main arena of the clash. AI and low-orbit space are crucial, according to Caracciolo. Taiwan remains a critical point. Fabry notes that the U.S. recognized it in 1972, Shanghai Communique, to separate Maoist China from the USSR. Today, it is recognized only by 15 minor governments and the Vatican. Caracciolo and Rampini express doubts about America's willingness to defend it militarily, given the imperial retreat and China's priority. The tariff offensive, pushing China to strengthen regional ties, ASEAN, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, could make a peaceful or at least Asian integration more likely, even if Taiwan does not want to be under Beijing. The war in Ukraine has had profound geopolitical consequences, especially in relations between the US, Russia, and China. According to Caracciolo, it has shown the limits of American military power, crisis in the arms industry, lack of ammunition, difficulty in recruitment due to fentanyl and declining patriotism, and convinced Washington that Russia is no longer a top military threat. It failed to conquer Kyiv and has taken only 20% of Ukraine in 3 years. However, the war has made Russia a minority partner of the Chinese system. China buys Russian hydrocarbons and grain at discounted prices, paying in yuan. This link concerns the US. Facing a China strengthened by Russian resources in 10 years is a scenario to avoid. That's why today the American apparatus, Pentagon, etc., is more supportive of Trump's opening to Russia, an obsession that Fabry traces back to a Playboy interview from March 1990. 8 years ago, during Trump's first term, this opening was blocked. 2 sanctions packages, US troops sent to Germany against Russia, impeachment for pressure on Zelensky, because the apparatus still saw Russia as a primary adversary. Now, the priority is to detach Moscow from Beijing, replicating Nixon-Mao's move from the 1970s. Fabry recalls that the US and Russia are not eternal enemies like Russia and England, citing Sting's song, Russians. The US has saved Russia 3 times. After the Crimean War, mid-1800s, in exchange for Alaska. After the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, Portsmouth Peace mediated by Teddy Roosevelt, and during World War II, Lend-Lease program, with aid greater than current assistance to Ukraine. Ongoing negotiations between Americans and Russians, and separately with Ukrainians, according to Caracciolo, concern little about Ukraine itself. Biden was clear. Small incursion. Tolerated. The goal was to bleed Russia. The real issues are oil price, crucial for Russia's budget, calculated at $79 per barrel, now collapsed to $64. Meetings in Saudi Arabia, the largest producer with the US and Russia, aim to stabilize it. Arctic. The potential opening of new sea routes due to ice melt involves the US, Russia, and China, threatening the centrality of the Mediterranean. Nuclear. Preventing Iran from obtaining an atomic bomb is a common interest. Imminent negotiations in Rome. Nuclear proliferation is seen as a growing risk in a multipolar world. Germany, Poland, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt might be tempted. Ukraine, Caracciolo concludes, is the real victim. A demographically devastated country, half its population lost since '91, dependent on foreign aid, destined to become a black hole full of weapons, similar to the Balkans but on a larger scale. Europe emerges from the analyses as profoundly disoriented and vulnerable. Used to 80 years of American protective umbrella, which Rampini defines as crucial even for the birth of post-war democracies, it suddenly finds itself exposed. Americans, as mentioned, see it as a burden, a collection of freeloaders who do not pay for their own defense. NATO, despite being full of weapons and soldiers, appears to Caracciolo as an empty box, without a clear purpose, now that the Russian threat is downplayed in the US perception. The presence of 105,000 American soldiers in Europe, 15,000 in Italy, second largest contingent after Germany, countries defeated in World War II, notes Caracciolo, becomes hard to justify. The Greenland episode, possible US annexation of a NATO Danish territory, and NATO Secretary-General Rutte's embarrassment highlight the uncertainty. Europe is also divided and in crisis. Caracciolo underscores the lack of a common position among the 27 on any relevant issue. Germany, the traditional engine, is in serious trouble. It lost cheap Russian gas, shares of the Chinese market, surpassed technologically in cars, and the prestige of the Merkel era. Its export-based economic model and absorption of European wealth no longer work. The recent decision by the outgoing government, Chancellor Scholz, MERS, to allocate €1 trillion, 800 defense, 200 environment, infrastructure, abandoning the debt to boot, marks an epical but also desperate shift. Caracciolo. Germany itself is internally divided, East versus West, rising nationalist, neo-Nazi parties. Rampini adds that the idea of a United States of Europe is an illusion. European nations, almost all ex-empires, are too different and historically conflictual to voluntarily merge. They lack a common people and a European public opinion. Faced with this situation, Europe is forced to rethink itself. There is a rush to rearm. Maloney aims for 2% of GDP for defense, also funding the US industry. Germany aims for huge sums, but there is no common strategic vision. Dependence on the US remains strong, but their reliability is in question. Rampini suggests that this phase could push Europe to rediscover and defend Western values, becoming its center, but he expresses skepticism about the willingness and ability of younger generations in Europe, who are also influenced by anti-Western narratives. Caracciolo speaks of a shift from stable alliances to transactional alignments on individual dossiers. Federico Rampini dedicates his speech to a passionate defense of the West against what he calls the dominant anti-Western conformism. His book Thanks, West aims to be a reconstituting cure and an injection of self-esteem, especially for the young. Rampini contests the narrative that paints the West as the supreme evil, reminding of its fundamental contributions to human progress. Material well-being, scientific and industrial revolution, born here thanks to the unique role of the bourgeoisie, agricultural technologies, green revolution that saved India and China from hunger, medicine, antibiotics, vaccines that have extended global life expectancy, plus 20 years in Africa in a century, energy, shift to less polluting sources, from wood to coal to oil to gas to renewables and nuclear, all Western inventions. Rights and values, democracy, rule of law, the concept of the Republic born in Rome, universal human rights, mass education, idea of public school for all, women's emancipation, feminism, household appliances, contraceptive pill, abolition of slavery, which existed elsewhere, pre-colonial Africa, the Arab Ottoman world, but was first abolished in the West, e.g. England in the early 1800s versus Saudi Arabia 1962. Even dissent and self-criticism are typically Western values. Rampini does not deny the crimes of the West, imperialism, slavery, but rejects the caricature and historical falsification that presents them as the only defining features of Western civilization, ignoring progress and the global historical context. He criticizes the imbecile snobbery of Westerners who lament idealized pasts of other cultures, e.g., Maasai huts versus modern homes, ignoring the harsh realities of poverty and mortality. He connects this debate to the current situation. Trump himself does not believe in the concept of the West as a community of values, treating European allies in a purely transactional manner. This could, paradoxically, push Europe to take charge of this legacy. However, Rampini is concerned that the amputation of historical memory and anti-Western brainwashing have weakened new generations in Europe. Rampini also offers a more optimistic vision of the resilience of American democracy, citing active counterpowers, the judiciary blocking Trump, critical press like the New York Times, federalism with states like California and New York in opposition. He defends the dynamism of the U.S. economy, Musk as an example of innovation against bureaucracy, startup meritocracy against European hereditary oligarchies. While acknowledging problems, public inefficiency, he cites the failures of California's high-speed rail and the costs of New York's subway. He concludes by citing Barack Obama, "Never been better than here, today, in the West, 2016, and Lebanese intellectual Amin Maalouf. Those who fight the West are headed for a failure worse than their own."